The room is heavy with cigarette smoke and tension. 8 men sit around a polished table. Representatives from each of Yugoslavia's 6 republics and 2 autonomous provinces. The chair, currently occupied by Macedonia's Lazar Kolishevsky, seems oversized, designed for a larger presence than any of them possess. It is December 1980, and we are in Belgrade, 7 months after Tito's funeral and the first meeting of Yugoslavia's collective presidency without its founding leader is underway. On the agenda, how to address the growing economic crisis. Foreign debt has reached $20 billion. Inflation is climbing. Import restrictions have created shortages of consumer goods. The International Monetary Fund is demanding austerity measures in exchange for new loans. Stane Donlach, the Slovenian representative, presents figures showing his republic's disproportionate contribution to federal funds that support less developed regions. We can no longer bear this burden, he argues. Our constituents are asking why they should sacrifice when the money seems to disappear into Kosovo and Macedonia with little improvement. Mahmoud Bakali, representing Kosovo, responds sharply. Perhaps Slovenia forgets that its industries were built with raw materials from the south at artificially low prices for decades. This is not charity. It is addressing historical imbalance. Serbia's Petar Stambolic interjects. The real issue is systemic inefficiency. Our self-management system has created thousands of unproductive enterprises that cannot compete globally, but are too politically sensitive to close. The discussion circles for hours, producing no decisions, only an agreement to form a committee to study economic reforms, a committee whose recommendations would later be blocked by the same regional interests represented in this room. As they prepare to adjourn, Kolishevsky sighs deeply. Comrades, he says, for 35 years, when we reached impasse, we could turn to one man for final arbitration. That option is gone. Now we must find consensus among ourselves, or there will be no decision at all. What none of them articulate is the growing fear. A system designed with endless checks and balances to prevent any republic from dominating others now seems incapable of decisive action in the face of mounting crisis. Like a bicycle built for 8 riders, it moved forward smoothly while a strong leader pointed the way, but now wobbles dangerously as each rider pedals in their preferred direction. In a quiet corner of the building, Milka Planic, soon to become Yugoslavia's first female prime minister, confides to an aide. The system was designed to prevent tyranny, but now prevents governance itself. And in this vacuum, old forces are already stirring. This is part 2 of our series on the Yugoslav breakup, after Tito. You know how they say you can't understand someone until you walk a mile in their shoes? Well, I'd argue you can't understand a nation until you've walked through its history. Not just the highlight reel or the sanitized version you find in textbooks. I mean really getting into its DNA. Those defining moments that shaped everything that came after. Those moments where paths were chosen, where decisions were made in palaces and backrooms and city streets that changed the course of millions of lives. I'm your host, Paul, and this is Double Helix, Blueprint of Nations, where we unravel the genetic code of countries through their most transformative moments. Think of it like ancestry testing, but for entire nations. We dig deep into the historical DNA, finding those crucial moments that made countries who they are today. In our previous episode, we explored Yugoslavia's creation as a deliberate attempt to to solve the puzzle of diverse peoples sharing deeply interconnected geography and history. Today, we investigate how this carefully balanced system began to unravel following Tito's death in 1980. The story of Yugoslavia in the 1980s is not primarily one of ancient ethnic hatreds resurging, though that narrative would later be deployed by nationalist leaders and international observers alike. Rather, it is a complex interplay of institutional paralysis, economic deterioration, and the opportunistic revival of nationalism as alternative sources of legitimacy collapse. To understand Yugoslavia's unraveling, we must first understand the economic crisis that provided its backdrop. After 3 decades of impressive growth that raised living standards dramatically across Yugoslavia, the economy hit severe turbulence in the late 1970s. Turbulence that became a nosedive in the 1980s. Workers cluster in small groups during their break, comparing strategies for surviving on salaries that inflation devours before they can spend them. The Sodaso chemical factory in Tuzla, once the pride of the city, now operates at half capacity in 1983. Bosnia's industrial heartland is becoming a showcase of Yugoslavia's economic decline. Jesna Horvat, an engineer whose parents were factory workers, recalls, "We went from planning summer vacations on the Adriatic to planning how to find coffee and detergent. My mother stood in lines for basic goods. My father took second jobs. The future, which had always seemed to get better year by year, suddenly looked worse." The numbers tell the story starkly. Between 1979 and 1985, real personal income fell by 25%. Inflation reached 50% by 1984. Unemployment doubled. Foreign debt ballooned to $20 billion, making Yugoslavia one of the most indebted developing nations relative to its size. This economic deterioration had multiple causes. The global oil crisis of the 1970s hit import-dependent Yugoslavia hard. The death of Tito coincided with a broader shift in global financial conditions as interest rates soared and loans that had seemed manageable became crushing burdens. But Yugoslavia's problems were also structural, rooted in its unique economic model that had both powered its rise and set the stage for its decline. Yugoslav market socialism, with its worker-managed enterprises and mix of plan and market, had created a distinctive middle path between Soviet centralization and Western capitalism. But it also produced chronic inefficiencies, enterprises that hoarded workers rather than optimized production, a banking system that provided soft loans based on political rather than economic criteria, and a federation structure that allowed republics to pursue contradictory economic policies. Ante Markovic, a Croatian economist who would later become Yugoslavia's last effective prime minister, described the system as 6 economies loosely wrapped in a federal package, with each increasingly pursuing its own interests rather than the complementary development. The International Monetary Fund, which Yugoslavia turned to for emergency loans, demanded harsh austerity measures that further depressed living standards while doing little to address underlying structural issues. Between 1980 and 1989, the IMF approved 4 standby arrangements with Yugoslavia, each requiring more painful cuts than the last. Belgrade, October 1988. Thousands of workers marched through the capital carrying signs protesting wage freezes, inflation, and unemployment. Similar demonstrations have erupted across the country, from Slovenia's industrial centers to Macedonia's struggling south. What's notable is that these protests still frame grievances in economic and class terms rather than ethnic ones. Workers from all backgrounds share the same complaints about a system that seems increasingly unable to deliver the prosperity it once promised. Yet beneath this surface unity, a more ominous fragmentation is occurring. In response to economic crisis, republics increasingly pursue policies that prioritize local interest over federal solutions. Slovenia and Croatia, the wealthier northern republics, resist sending funds to the federal center for redistribution to poorer regions. Serbia and Montenegro push for re-centralization to maintain flows from north to south. Economic debates become increasingly zero-sum, framed as conflicts between regional interests rather than shared challenges. As political scientist Valerie Bunce observes, the very institutions designed to manage diversity by giving each republic a voice now prevented coordinated responses to shared threats. Each republic could effectively veto federal economic reforms it saw as threatening its interests, leading to paralysis exactly when decisive action was needed. The institutional deadlock created a growing legitimacy crisis. The Yugoslav system had justified itself to citizens primarily through rising living standards and protecting national equality. As it proved unable to maintain prosperity, even while enforcing austerity unequally across regions, both pillars of legitimacy began to crumble. But economic crisis alone doesn't explain Yugoslavia's disintegration. Many countries have weathered worse economic storms without falling apart. What made Yugoslavia particularly vulnerable was the combination of economic decline, institutional paralysis, and the availability of nationalist narratives as alternative sources of meaning and mobilization. Let's explore how the ideological vacuum created by Tito's death and communist exhaustion created space for nationalist revival. Not as spontaneous eruption, though, but as a deliberate political strategy. Belgrade, 1986. The Serbian Academy of Sciences and Arts is preparing a memorandum on the crisis of Yugoslav society. What begins as an analysis of economic and political problems evolves into something more explosive, a document that would later be seen as the intellectual foundation for Serbian nationalism's revival. The memorandum, leaked to the press before completion, frames Serbia's position within Yugoslavia as one of victimhood and exploitation. It claims Serbs face genocide in Kosovo, discrimination in Croatia, and economic subordination from the Federation. Most provocatively, it argues that the 1974 Constitution, with its enhanced autonomy for provinces within Serbia, has left Serbs uniquely disadvantaged among Yugoslav nations. Prominent intellectual Dobrica Kosic, once a committed communist who became increasingly nationalist through the 1970s and 80s, argues in private discussions. A communist dismembered Serbia to weaken the Yugoslav state's strongest nation. Now Serbs alone are prevented from fully exercising their national rights. This narrative, that communist Yugoslavia had systematically disadvantaged Serbs despite its sacrifices in its creation, found fertile ground in the population facing economic hardship and uncertainty about the future. It offered a compelling explanation for suffering that directed anger outwards rather than at systemic failures. And there's that theme again. Simple solutions to complex problems is the playground of demagogues. What's crucial to understand is that similar processes were occurring in the other republics, though timing and specific grievances varied. For instance, in Croatia, the Croatian Spring in the early 1970s had already revealed nationalist sentiments that Tito suppressed but never fully eliminated. In Slovenia, intellectuals increasingly questioned whether their republic's economic interests were served by remaining tied to what they saw as a dysfunctional federation. Slovenian journalist Miran Lešak wrote in 1987, "We are financing a system that cannot reform itself. Each dinar sent to Belgrade is a dinar wasted. The question is no longer whether we can fix Yugoslavia, but what relationship with it best serves Slovenia's future. This intellectual ferment might have remained confined to academic and literary circles if not for ambitious politicians who recognized nationalism's potential to mobilize populations and consolidate power as communist legitimacy waned. A helicopter descends from the sky, rotors cutting through the spring air. The crowd below stirs with anticipation. When Slobodan Milosevic, then a mid-level communist functionary, steps out onto the field near Kosovo Polje, few suspect this April day in 1987 will later be marked as a turning point in Yugoslavian history. He's been sent to address Serbian grievances in Kosovo, where ethnic tensions between Serbs and the Albanian majority have been rising. Local Serbs have organized protests, claiming discrimination and pressure to leave what they consider their historic homeland. The location itself carries symbolic weight. It was the site of the famed 1389 battle that holds mythic status in Serbian national consciousness. When police, mostly ethnic Albanians, pushed back demonstrators trying to enter the meeting hall, Milosevic steps out to address the crowd. In a moment captured by television cameras, he urges words that will transform both his career and Yugoslavia's trajectory. No one should dare to beat you. The crowd erupts. For Serbs who feel abandoned by the system, the simple words represent recognition of their grievances at last. For Milosevic, the reaction reveals a powerful political current that he can harness. Within months, he consolidates control over Serbia's League of Communists, purging rivals and embracing increasingly nationalist rhetoric while maintaining communist structures of power. A hybrid approach that political scientist Veljko Bujacic terms nationalist communism. What makes this moment pivotal isn't just Milosevic's personal ambition, but how it begins a chain reaction across Yugoslavia. As Serbian nationalism becomes more assertive under his leadership, it triggers defensive nationalism in other republics. Leaders in Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia who might have preferred reform now must respond to constituents who fear Serbian dominance. Milan Kucan, Slovenia's reform-minded communist leader, explains the dynamic in a private meeting. We faced a choice: embrace Slovenian national interests explicitly, or be replaced by those who would. Milosevic's actions made neutrality impossible. By 1988, Milosevic has expanded his influence beyond Serbia proper, orchestrating the anti-bureaucratic revolution, a series of staged protests that topple leadership in Vojvodina, Montenegro, and Kosovo, replacing them with his allies. This gives him effective control of 4 of the 8 votes in Yugoslavia's collective presidency. Not enough to dominate completely, but sufficient to block any alternative he opposes. Slovenia and Croatia watched these developments with growing alarm. In a previously unthinkable development, defense planners in Ljubljana began quietly assessing how Slovenia might defend itself if Yugoslavia's federal institutions collapse. In Zagreb, nationalist figures marginalized since the Croatian Spring gradually re-emerge in public discourse. Franjo Tuđman, a former general turned dissident historian who was imprisoned in the 1970s for nationalist views, begins gathering support among Croatian emigres and intellectuals. Like Milosevic, he recognizes the political opportunity created by communist collapse and rising insecurity. Unlike Milosevic, he explicitly rejects communism, positioning himself as both nationalist and democratic, a combination appealing to Croatians seeking distance from both Yugoslavia and its founding ideology. These nationalist revivals didn't occur in isolation, but interacted with and reinforced each other, creating what political scientists call the spiral of nationalism. Each nationalist claim prompted defensive counterclaims. Each symbolic provocation demanded a response. Each historical grievance unearthed required countering narrative. Let me take you to another moment that captures this escalating dynamic. We're in the capital of Slovenia in June 1989. The Slovenian leadership has permitted a public gathering to protest human rights abuses in Kosovo, where Milosevic has revoked autonomy and imposed martial law. The event explicitly supports Kosovo Albanians, directly challenging Serbia's actions. In response, Serbia announces an economic boycott of Slovenian goods. Serbian media denounced Slovenia as a traitor to Yugoslav unity. Spontaneous protests in Belgrade see crowds dumping Slovenian products in the streets. Zoran Dimitrijevic, a Belgrade shopkeeper who participates in these protests, explains his feelings. Slovenia took money from the Federation for decades, and now they side with Albanians against Serbs? They want independence? Let them have it, but not with our markets. In Slovenia, this reaction only confirms growing conviction that Yugoslavia is no longer viable. Janez Janša, a young dissident who will later become one of independent Slovenia's prime ministers, writes in an opposition magazine, Serbia's reaction proves dialogue is impossible. They understand only submission or separation. This cycle, provocation, counter-provocation, escalation, plays out across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Economic relations, media exchanges, cultural events, historical commemorations. Each turn of the spiral makes compromise more difficult and positions more entrenched. Particularly destructive is the media war that erupts across Republican boundaries. Television stations and newspapers that once promoted brotherhood and unity increasingly frame events in nationalist terms. Issues that might have been seen as complex policy disagreements become existential threats to national interest. Croatian journalist Ivan Lovrinovic observed this transformation from inside a Sarajevo newsroom. We watched colleagues who had written about worker solidarity for decades suddenly discover their ethnic consciousness overnight. News that once celebrated connections between republics now emphasized the differences in the threats. The language itself changed. Neighboring republics became them and the others. This media climate created what sociologist Veljko Vukacic called reality tunnels, or echo chambers in today's parlance, separate information ecosystems where the same events receive completely different interpretations, depending on which republic's media reported them. Citizens increasingly inhabited divergent realities, making shared understanding, the prerequisite for compromise, even more elusive. These reality tunnels were not unique to Yugoslavia. We saw them emerge with deadly consequences in Rwanda, where Hutu power radio transformed neighbors into enemies through language that dehumanized Tutsis as cockroaches. We witnessed similar dynamics in the Spanish Civil War, where Republicans and nationalists developed entirely different narratives about the same events, making reconciliation nearly impossible. What makes these information divides so dangerous is how they function as self-reinforcing systems. Once inside a particular reality tunnel, every new piece of information gets filtered through its interpretative lens. Facts that confirm the narrative are amplified, those that challenge it are dismissed or reinterpreted. The tunnel doesn't just shape what you know, it shapes how you process what you learn. In Yugoslavia, this meant a Serb in Belgrade, a Croat in Zagreb, and a Bosniak in Sarajevo could witness the exact same political developments, but perceived three fundamentally different events with three different sets of implications. When these divided perceptions calcify, violence begins to seem not just possible, but necessary. A tragic pattern that we've seen repeated across continents for decades, which is repeating itself today in our world. By late 1989, Yugoslavia's disintegration was accelerating across multiple fronts. The economic crisis had reached catastrophic proportions, with inflation hitting 1,000% annually, wiping out savings and forcing people to convert paychecks to German marks the moment they received them. The Berlin Wall had fallen, removing the external geopolitical pressure that had historically incentivized Western support for Yugoslav unity. The nationalist leaders were consolidating control in several republics, preparing for what increasingly seemed like inevitable conflict. What makes this period so tragic in retrospect is how many Yugoslavs recognized the dangers but felt powerless to alter the trajectory. Anti-war demonstrators in major cities attracted thousands. Polls showed most citizens prioritized economic issues over nationalist concerns. Cross-Republican initiatives by intellectuals called for democratic reform that might preserve some form of common state. Ante Markovic, appointed federal prime minister in 1989, launched ambitious economic reforms that briefly reduced inflation and showed promise. For a few months, in early 1990, his popularity exceeded that of any Republican leader, suggesting many citizens still hoped for a reformed Yugoslavia rather than dissolution. But Markovic lacked what nationalist leaders increasingly possess: institutional power bases within specific republics and control over security forces. His reforms threatened too many entrenched interests, from Communist Party apparatchiks to emerging economic elites benefiting from the system's dysfunction. Most fatally, he had no answer to the fundamental political question increasingly framed in zero-sum terms: who would control a reformed Yugoslavia? As one anonymous federal official told a Western journalist in late 1989, "We're approaching the moment where compromise becomes mathematically impossible. Serbia will not accept less power in the Federation. Slovenia and Croatia will not accept more Serbian influence. The system requires consensus, but the positions have become mutually exclusive." We now stand at the threshold of Yugoslavia's final act. The 1990 elections, the first multi-party contest since World War II, would bring nationalist parties to power across most republics, replacing communists who had lost all legitimacy. The new leaders would approach Yugoslavia's challenges not as a problem to solve, but as opportunities to exploit. Zagreb, December 1989. The Petrovic family, mixed Serbian and Croatian. They gather for what will be their last unified holiday celebration. Political arguments that once ended in laughter now produce genuine anger. Cousin no longer speaks to cousin. The youngest generation watches in confusion as adults who taught them brotherhood and unity now speak of ancient grievances and common conflicts. Rejana Petrovic, who we met weeping at Tito's funeral nearly a decade earlier, tries to maintain peace at the table. But when her Serbian father and Croatian uncle come to blows over whether Croatia has the right to leave Yugoslavia, she realizes something fundamental has broken. The tragedy, she later wrote, wasn't just that Yugoslavia collapsed as a state, it's that it collapsed within us, within families, friendship, neighborhoods. The borders hardened in our hearts before they appeared on maps. As 1989 ended and 1990 began, Yugoslavia still existed on maps, in institutions, and passports. Its Red Star flag still flew over government buildings. Its sports teams still competed internationally. This currency, though devastated by inflation, still circulated. But the invisible bonds that held it together, the shared vision, the mutual trust, belief in common future, had already severed. What remained was a hollowed shell waiting for the forces now in motion to shatter it completely. Next time on Double Helix. As 1990 dawns, the stage is set for the final act in Yugoslavia's drama. The economic crisis has made the Federation seem more burden than benefit. The leadership vacuum created by Tito's death has been filled with figures pursuing radically different visions. We'll witness how intellectuals and politicians transform economic grievances into ethnic resentments, how historical memories become weapons in contemporary struggles, and how ordinary citizens who once shared workplaces, neighborhoods, and even families find themselves sorted into hardening national categories that will soon determine who lives, who dies, and who flees the land that they've called home for generations. Until then, thank you for listening. We will see you soon.